Civilization 6 Competitor and the new turn-based 4X historical strategy game from Oxide Studios, Ara History Untold, the one you're seeing on screen here, has an insiders program, and within that secret and exclusive program that anybody can sign up for, we've received not only a technical alpha build of the game to play if you were lucky enough to get your hands on it, but also developers' diaries. And this month's one came out a few days ago now, but the information inside of it is oh so sweet. So sit back and relax as we delve through the new things that we've learned about Ara History Untold, now that some people have some impressions on the game, and of course, as I mentioned, following up on that crucial developer's diary where they touch on things that I reckon a lot of you will probably be interested in. Things like, what's the role of realism? Is it an alternate history game, or is it realistic, cartoony, or real and core to the earthly experience? In the background, you're going to see, speaking of earthly experiences, some Civilization 6 gameplay, and also I'll be showing some screenshots like this new one here of Ara History Untold. I'll keep them on screen for around 10 seconds each. You can pause if you want to study them further. Let's begin. Firstly, they reflect on the overall mood of the game. You might reflect on some games as being gritty and real, like I mentioned in the introduction, others maybe cartoony, fantastical. They describe Ara History Untold as optimistic, and let me give you a quote. Optimism is the driving force. The player expects the experience to be fair and winnable. They're not cheated by systems or AI, and they go on to say that it doesn't feel like they should quit midway through. There's always a possible solution to a problem, and no tasks are ever unwinnable, within reason, of course. And they mention specifically, if you jump in and you don't know what you're doing and the difficulty's on high, then you're going to have a bad time. But overall, the word that they use that, quote, permeates the design, the music, and the artwork, end quote, of the game is optimism. This isn't a lot to go on, so I won't dwell too much further on this point other than to say they make a specific mention that they didn't want the game to be grim dark, self-serious, self-important, or overly pedantic and fussy. That is a direct quote, all of those descriptors. They are fantastic descriptors, and I think it sets the overall mood for Ara History Untold. Now let's move through and talk about the next point, which, to be honest, I think kind of articulates it in a little bit more detail, a little bit better. Here they use the word charming instead, but it's more about balancing the yin and the yang, the good and the bad. They go on to say that we've all played games like post-apocalyptic worlds where there's an underlying sense of dread destruction, right? And we can probably all resonate with this. It's a serious world, a foreboding world. The stakes are high, it's fast-paced. There's a sense of urgency behind our decisions. The same can also, of course, play out in a strategy game as well. You don't just need to think Doom Eternal or whatever. They argue that therein lies a problem. There is no contrast. If everything is doom and gloom, then nothing is. That is a fantastic, slightly morphed Incredibles quote, and I love it. I think there is a good point behind that, though. They go on to say that they will grapple, of course, with some very heavy topics from history throughout the game. And as we can imagine, that makes total sense. Human history is gory and awful at times. In fact, probably the worst of stories. They go on to say, though, that they're also trying to balance that out by employing light humor, charm, where appropriate, and created opportunities within the world to be charmed. This makes me think of things like random events in a game like Crusader Kings, where everything might be sort of falling apart in the empire around you, but a funny event comes up about some relationship that your wife's having with the servant or something. That's probably not actually a particularly funny example, but you get the idea. There are ways to insert charm and light humor in these worlds, even when they're telling serious stories. And I'm really glad that they brought that up, because I think that, personally, I will enjoy a strategy game or any game the most when it does strike a balance between those two. Yes, it's nice to have the balance of yin, yang, light and dark, but also variety is the spice of life, and we need some spice to keep it interesting. Speaking of interesting, I think probably the most interesting of all may be this point, around realism. And as we look at this screenshot with what looks like the Colosseum at the front, Pyramid of Giza up the back left, maybe Himeji Castle even in the bottom right, we think a little bit about how realistic ought a game like this be. Will Ara History Untold be realistic or fantastical? Here they use the word immersed. They want us to be immersed in a sense of scale that is historically believable, and throughout the game there's a level of consistency to it, rather than a purely realistic title. It's a little bit of wordplay, maybe there's a little bit of semantics here, but I think it's an important point. Believable of all things turned out to be a bit of a contentious thing in early discussions, they say. There was a lot of debate around the use of the word versus something like authentic, historically authentic. With a game based in history accounts, of course, at its core, there is always going to be a level of accuracy that they need to deliver, right? They can't just call it a historical game and then not do their due diligence and not do their research on how these cultures or histories, should be shaped. What names should the leaders have? I don't know what details they're talking about specifically, but it's that kind of thing. They argue that it should be grounded in that consistent and believable base of history, but not be completely tied to exactly how history unfolded. Because here, of course, it's in the name of the game, this is about history untold. Grounded in history, but stories potentially untold. The example that they give in the developer's diary is, and I'll just deliver it as a direct quote here. Quote, "Want your Mayans to discover metallurgy in the early Iron Age and train up the most ferocious army of knights the world has ever seen? Sure, go for it. Is this authentic to history? Nope. But is it believable? And within the bounds of the world set in place? Sure thing." End quote. You can kind of get the idea that they're going for here. Are you going to fly away in an alien spaceship as the Mayans in the early Iron Age? Probably not. But in your alternate history, grounded in some realism and believability, it's a feasible enough thing. And that's the level of believability and realism that we'll likely be dealing with in Ara History Untold. Next, they talk about the complexity of the game. Will it be a min-maxy experience, or will I have some creative freedom and agency? As a strategy title, it's imperative for players to have the opportunity to feel, and the buzzword here is clever. They have no interest, and they talked about this a little bit in previous diaries. If you haven't seen those, I've covered them on my channel too. In making a game that is purely min-max focused, nor, it seems, do they have an interest in making a game that sort of can feel overwhelmingly daunting at first. I'm not sure what a relatable example might be, because it's going to be different for everybody. But it might be something like if you sat down and you wanted to play a grand strategy game, one that you've never played before, like Hearts of Iron 4, maybe Europa Universalis, and you just can't do it. It's too hard. And so instead of playing through, you give up. I don't have time for this. It's too complicated. I can't do it. The goal here, as they say, is that they don't want a player to feel dumb or not smart enough to play. Is the game complicated? They say, sure, it will be. Will you be able to learn it in one go? No. But you will be able to rise to the challenge. And again, here they're trying to argue that they'll be striking a balance. A balance between difficulty, but also giving us enough agency that we can kind of play to our strengths, be more learnable, flexible, and ultimately masterable, hopefully while still being approachable for most people. Now, that's a lot of big old buzzwords. In a nutshell, will the game be complex, complicated? Yeah, but it should be accessible enough that it won't turn everybody away just looking at it. And if the debate around point 3 could have been contentious, then this last one will probably take the cake. Here we hear about personal empowerment, from things like customization within the game through to diversity and expression. Again, this is one of those ones that may not necessarily represent history as it was told, and therefore there is points of contention around it. They go on to say that an aspect of this game will be personal empowerment, representation, and expression. Here's a quote from the developer's diary. "I will happily own up that I am one of those players that likes to pick avatars and characters that resonate more with me personally, and not just pick things for pure stats awesomeness. I sometimes struggle to identify with old dead white guys. I am that person that gets irrationally mad at character creators when they don't have curly hair options. Why can I only make my character taller, not shorter? You know the drill." End quote. And I think that summarizes the design sentiment, perhaps, behind what they're going for here. I mean, obviously it does, because they've decided to put that in. Alongside respecting the player's intelligence, they argue, we also want to try and respect the rest of you. We've strived to create content that is representative of a wide range of players. The idea being that anyone, regardless of who they are, can find something or someone within the game to identify with and say, hey, yep, that is me. And I see some of this in the comments, actually, in YouTube videos around, say, Humankind game is a good example. When they brought out the Cultures of Latin America DLC pack, I remember reading many comments from people who said, oh, wow, my culture or my country or what have you is finally in a game. I don't often see this. And so I can resonate with that point because I feel like that makes a lot of sense. I mean, I come from New Zealand, and while we're probably a little bit better represented than some others, we also do tend to get left out and overlooked, especially on world maps. But that's a topic for another video. I finally conclude by saying and setting a little bit of an expectation that while the game is, another quote, ginormous as all heck, end quote, they had to make some decisions on what to include and what not to include, and they can always do better here. The expectation set, obviously, don't expect every single person and every single thing to be in the game. But the takeaway that we should probably pull from this is actually twofold. Firstly, that there will be, of course, a bounded historical realism, but that they'll be introducing that alternate history storytelling, and that will play out in customization. Some of the things they at least allude to here are customizable characters, things that resonate personally with you, depending on perhaps what you look like, maybe where you come from or live. The second thing to take away, potentially more broadly thinking about the scale of the game, is that it will likely be massive. And there should be, or at least they've touted this, not just in this developer's diary, but in previous ones as well, there should be many, many ways for us to play. Potentially, thinking a little bit more broadly, addressing one of the concerns with some relevant and recent 4X games. The one that comes to mind for me personally is Humankind, which some people argue doesn't have enough of a scope to it. I personally disagree, but there is an argument out there that there isn't enough scope, not in the number of cultures, but in the number of players that can be in a game. It is at a maximum, in the default vanilla game anyway, 10-player cap. Which actually brings us to a good final point, thinking about what's next for Ara History Untold after this developer's diary on Tone. Firstly, it's important to note that we really don't know a lot about the technical details. How many players will be in a game was a good example, but there are many, many, many more that underlie that. We really need to get a feel for actually how it plays in practice. Secondly, and perhaps more importantly, some people have been lucky enough to do that. They have been relatively quiet, close-lipped around the technical alpha that I understand was running for a weekend or a week or something along those lines. It concluded relatively recently. And for the record, I should note this is not a sponsored video. I have nothing to do with the company. I didn't play the alpha. I wasn't invited to participate in the alpha. I have no nothing whatsoever. And I say this just to be really clear, because there's always that one person who will comment below. And if they do, you can timestamp them at 12:50 and say L plus ratio nerd, he, or something. I don't know. Either way, what is truly next for Ara History Untold, as I understand it, is the continuation of those technical alphas and then moving through perhaps to a more broader one, or at least we'll see a scaling up of how many players can participate. My understanding is the initial one was, of course, fairly closed and quiet and tightly kept. But we should expect to see that open up a little bit more. They have signaled, as I mentioned at the start of the video, that the Ara History Untold alpha will be open, potentially public, toward the end of 2022. So maybe as we move through towards November, December, we might all get the opportunity, or at least a lot of us get the opportunity, to get our hands on the game and try it out. Then moving through, at least as far as Microsoft told us some months ago at their presentation, we should expect to see Ara History Untold release in full in early 2023. I'll be sure to keep you up to date with all of the Ara History Untold as it unfolds, so do subscribe if you'd like to see more and hear some more fantastic puns like that, and I will see you next time. Take care, everybody.